businesses are realizing the importance of being customer centric, there's a growing need for a guide that maps out the customer journey with empathy led solutions at its core. Now, to meet this demand, companies are identifying the innovative potential of their people and tapping into by building a culture of design thinking. Now, it's become a go to approach for many companies, helping them gain deep insights into their customers. It's not just about improving your products and services anymore, it's about transforming entire business models. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Analytics Insight podcast, where we unpack the ideas, technologies, and strategies shaping the future of business and society. And I'm your host, Priya Dialani. Now, design thinking, when we think of it, it isn't just a trendy phrase, it's a methodology that centers innovation on human needs, empathy, rapid prototyping, and iterative learning. Now, in an age where AI has the power to automate, predict, and even personalize like never before, design thinking ensures our innovations stay grounded in solving real problems for real people rather than chasing some shiny technology for its own sake. So, let's welcome Varun Nagaraj, Dean and Professor of Information Management and Analytics at SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research, Mumbai, to dive into a topic that sits at the intersection of creativity, empathy, and cutting edge technology, that is wise innovation through design thinking in the AI era. Hi Varun, how are you doing?
I'm well, Priya. Thank you. And thanks for having me on your show.
Great. It's a pleasure to have you with us on our podcast today. And we have heard about design thinking and, what exactly its implications are. But having said that, where we are, living in an AI era and where the world is progressively, increasingly adopting AI, I think how design thinking is kind of changing the entire business landscape is something that we'll be learning today from your insights. But before we dive deep into it, we would like to know more about SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research. I mean, I know about the institute, but what's something that, what sets the institute apart, and what is something that you would like to share with our listeners today?
Sure thing. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak about SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research. As many of your listeners would know, we are one of the leading business schools in India. But we're also a slightly different kind of business school, which is the question you were asking. Most business schools were set up with the idea of creating business leaders or pretty standard kinds of managers. SPJIMR, since its founding, has always focused on trying to create leaders or influence society in ways that go beyond simply the bottom line. So the idea of creating socially sensitive managers was actually at the root of SPJIMR's foundation, back 30, 35 years ago. But over the last 10 years, if you think about the world and how it has changed, just creating socially responsible or socially conscious managers is necessary but not sufficient. Because these managers, or even the ideas that you create, have to go out and get implemented in a world which is rapidly changing, in a world where it's not clear what really the right answer is or should be. And so, and a lot of these changes are coming about because of technology, and a lot of the solutions that are out there also use technology. So the idea of looking at the intersection of technology and society, or technology and societal impact, has sort of been what has guided SPJIMR over the last several years. So the term wise innovation that we use essentially refers to the fact that we at SPJIMR would like to contribute to a conversation and to the capabilities of this country in terms of being able to innovate for positive outcomes. And this kind of innovation obviously involves not just individuals or leaders, it involves processes and methodologies and tools as well, which is the reason why I think we're having this discussion on design thinking today, because that is definitely one of the essential tools that is part of the toolkit.
Great. Thank you so much for that insightful overview of SPJIMR and, of course, its unique positioning in the world of management education. And I'm really glad that you highlighted the organization's focus on blending technology with some true values, a combination that feels especially relevant right now as industries across the board, are grappling with rapid technological changes and evolving expectations around responsible leadership. So I think the institute is not just a teaching management, but it is also redefining what it means to lead in a very dynamic and interconnected world. Moving ahead, Varun, you have held senior leadership roles, including C-level responsibilities for venture-funded startups as well as public companies in the US. So we would like to know more about you, Varun. So if you could help us understand more about yourself, how has the journey been till date, and what triggered your interest at SPJN, and what are certain role or contributions that you usually take care of at the institute?
Sure thing. I'll spend only a little bit of time on the front end. It makes one feel like an old grandfather talking about all the things they used to do and so on. So, but in a nutshell, uh, post my education, which is as an engineer from IIT, my focus and my career entirely in the United States has been around innovation of different kinds. So I've had the opportunity to innovate as an engineer, building cool new products, as a product manager, bringing some of these products to market or helping define them, as a management consultant, where I was a consultant and a partner in the world's leading innovation management consulting firm called PRTM, along with then taking on leadership roles where the primary emphasis of the company was always to innovate, and that's kind of what my background is as a practitioner on the ground, trying to figure out open spaces or white spaces where technology and other structures can be applied to create something new and different that adds value. So that was essentially what my background was all about. Now, as one sort of progresses in one's career, you look for greater impact that one could make, right? And the greater impact can come from building amazing companies, of course, that do the right thing. The greater impact can also come from influencing minds. The greater impact can also come from building an institution that might be able to carry on this goal of creating positive innovation. And so that was really behind my shift from industry and entirely in the United States to academia, in India. And I consider it a blessing because I hope that with the many, many minds that I get to interact with and hopefully influence, that there is a force multiplier effect. Anybody in industry knows that you can only do so much by yourself. And that's why in a sales organization, when you look at channels, right, you refer to them as a sales multiplier. So similarly, I look at the minds I get a chance to interact with as influence multipliers. And I think that's a unique benefit that academia gives you that I have certainly enjoyed. So with that in mind, SPJIMR was a very natural fit for me, given that its mission was already around social inclusion and social change. And I was able to bring in a Silicon Valley mindset, if you will, around innovation and try and marry the two together. And so the emphasis on innovation for good or innovation for societal impact, not necessarily just technology, by the way. Innovation can come in multiple forms, right? It can come in the form of social structures. It can come in the form of business models or processes. So it's not always just, product and technology based. But innovation can drive change, and the ability to use innovation or harness innovation for positive change was what excited me. And so here I am at SPJIMR and living the life, as they'd say.
Great, that's really insightful, and thank you for sharing your a candid look into your journey and, of course, your work at SPJIMR. And I mean, the passion and strategic thinking that you bring to your role truly stands out, and it's clear that the impact that we see definitely is far beyond the classroom walls. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate understanding the depth of commitment that is required to keep an institution like SPJN at the forefront of management education. So let's build on that foundation now as we explore some of the broader trends we are seeing in the industry today. So if you talk about design thinking particularly, now a lot of people don't know what lies at the heart of Netflix enduring success. So it's not just exceptional content. I think it's their innovative problem solving approach rooted in design thinking. Now this strategy has empowered Netflix to adapt, continuously evolve, and remain at the forefront of a constantly changing industry. So with this, Netflix has now transformed into a household name, reshaping the way we experience movies and shows by integrating design thinking. So, how do you define the relationship between design thinking and building a successful digital ecosystem in today's business environment?
Okay, I think if you don't mind, I'll take it a little bit off track here. I think we don't want to conflate design thinking and technology too quickly, right? I think it's important to get a good handle on what design thinking is, with really no reference to technology at all. So we'll talk a little bit about design thinking and its role in innovation. Then we can talk a little bit about how digital technologies, especially AI, might be modifying this particular process. Would that be all right if we, deviate
Yes,
it a little bit like this?
yes,
Okay.
definitely.
Thank you. So let's take a look at sort of design thinking. Design thinking is something that has emerged, from the 1960s onwards, right? Sometimes we tend to think everything is very recent, but the whole idea was that there are ways in which designers think, and specifically designers were people who were architects, people who were product designers, people who were map makers, right? So the question was, what is it that these guys do in order to be able to transform these vague ideas into things that people actually enjoy, right? So design is essentially what got it going. It was never a business concept. So the idea was, how do designers actually think? And can one then distill that into something that is applicable in business? So that's basically how design thinking got going, right? By understanding the minds of the designers. And so it comes very much from a world of art and elegance and aesthetics and so forth. Now, what ends up happening, of course, through the 80s or 90s is there is one particular organization called IDEO, which is a well-known consulting firm, that figures out a way of taking the key ideas of design thinking and packaging it in a way that businesses can relate to. And so, therefore, the design thinking process that we generally tend to think about owes a lot to the work that IDEO did to try and package some of these ideas, but the ways in which designers approach problems. Can you extract from that the core principles and build a process that engineers can use, that marketeers can use, that ad campaign folks can use, that Netflix can use, and so forth? So therefore, design thinking becomes kind of a way of innovating, starting, let's say, in the 80s and 90s, if you will, right? As opposed to, in the 60s, where it was more of an intellectual concept. And as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, design thinking essentially is built around four dimensions. The first dimension is that of deep insights. Do you understand who you're building a solution for, or what problem they're trying to solve? Have you gotten into their minds at a level far deeper than a simple survey would give you? So it's not about just customer discovery by doing surveys and so forth. It's really ethnographically, if you will, trying to get into the shoes of the person that you're trying to benefit. That's the first part, the empathy part that we talk about. And yes, it is a human-centric approach because that is step number one. Then the idea is that there are so many possible ways of solving a problem that it is good to stay in a creative, open space for a period of time. And that's called sort of the divergent space. And then from an ideation point of view, which is another term within design thinking, you look at an infinite number of possibilities, different ways of solving a particular problem, not just one. So you don't focus in too quickly. Then, based on having a portfolio of possible approaches, you begin to figure out which ones may I actually prototype and bring to market or bring to the beneficiary so I can see what works and what doesn't work. And let me be prepared for rapid failure, and let me be prepared to actually iterate till I figure out which of my many possible ideas, refined in a particular manner, provides the most amount of benefit, right? This is the generic design thinking approach that all companies have used, Netflix or otherwise, right? So again, nothing to do with technology. It's just a way of helping the innovator understand what problem he or she is trying to solve, why, and the many ways of possibly solving it. So that's design thinking as a process. However, there's another nuance which is important for your listeners to understand, that when you look at innovation processes, a process is a sequential series of steps, right? That's how you define a process. Design thinking can be implemented in that manner. So when you have an Accenture doing a big design thinking project for a HDFC bank, let's say, they would actually have steps that follow these four building blocks that I talked about. But more often than not, that's not the way how design thinking is done. Design thinking basically becomes a set of principles or ideals, right? The ideals that you need to understand the beneficiary really well. The ideal that you need to brainstorm and be comfortable with many possible solutions, none of which might be perfect. The ideal that you have to prototype, and the ideal that without actual tangible usage of a product, you really don't know how something will work. And the ideal that it's okay to fail and iterate. These ideals get incorporated into existing innovation processes. So if you went into a Mahindra, you went into a Godrej, they would have existing innovation processes with design thinking elements in them, meaning they have taken these ideals and embedded it into the sequential innovation processes that they already have. So when a lot of folks talk about design thinking, they always talk about it as an end-to-end process, the way a consulting firm might do it. But in the real world, design thinking is more often than not a set of principles or ideas that have been embedded into innovation processes. All right. So Netflix may or may not actually be using design thinking as a process. Netflix uses a lean startup method, agile way of development. But that lean startup method process, which is their innovation process, incorporates the notion that customers are at the centric or users are at the center of their entire experience. So the Netflix process, which is an agile process, not a design thinking process, actually incorporates a lot of design thinking elements, which is what allows Netflix to do what it does. So I know that distinction sounds very professorial. I'm sorry, that is my job. But I think it is important for your listeners to understand that design thinking isn't just a process. It can also be a set of cool concepts, tools, and principles that are embedded in other innovation processes. So I wanted to get that out of the way before jumping into how AI changes things and so on. But I hope I didn't become too professorial in the process.
Thank you for sharing those insights, and definitely a very different perspective that we have taken today, as well as with my listeners. So, of course, it's not an end-to-end process, and I think, like you mentioned, it's more of an ideas that are embedded into the innovation process. And it's really interesting to understand that design thinking isn't just about aesthetics or user experience, but it's kind of anchoring the entire digital ecosystems more into the empathy, iteration, and real human needs. And I think what we really need is a flexible ecosystem that underscores that design thinking is not just a one-time workshop, but it is moreover a mindset that can guide organizations through the entire journey of the digital transformation, if they are willing to take that. So thank you for those insights. And like I said, we will of course be talking about the role of technology here in digital, in design thinking and in digital environment. So when we're talking about design thinking, I think there are mixed feelings about the rise of AI and its impact on creativity. And we believe that human creativity will continue to play a crucial role as AI evolves, because I think creativity is very vital to help us imagine the future. And I think that's where we would want the role of AI also to play in that future. Now, the combination of AI and design thinking, I believe, has a potential to transform the way we solve problems and, of course, innovate. And, design thinking, I mean, it's a human centered approach because it focuses on understanding human needs and creatively addressing human challenges. Whereas, on the other hand, AI, it brings capabilities like data analytics, prediction, and automation to the table. So, while design thinking is about empathy and experimentation and iteration, like you mentioned in your response, how do you think AI can augment these steps, particularly in the problem solving, in the problem discovery and iteration phases?
Fair enough. It's a good question. So, we teach design thinking here at SPJIMR. And over the last year or so, we have certainly been rethinking how we teach and what we teach, right? Because AI is such a powerful player in this innovation process. It's important to understand how it changes design thinking. So I'll share with you what my faculty colleagues and I, have been discussing at workshops as we refine the way we do design thinking or the way we teach design thinking. So let's get back to the 4 building blocks of design thinking. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to those 4 building blocks, where we talked about the idea of sort of customer empathy or customer centricity, right, as the first step. We talked about the idea of sort of brainstorming and ideation and having many, many solution options as a second step. We then talked about prototyping, making things real as a third step. And then we talked about iteration as a fourth step. So I'm going to talk about how AI changes these 4 steps, because that's really what we're trying to do, right? In a pre-AI world, we used to do it a certain way. Now, incorporating AI, we can actually do it in a far more interesting way. And so AI actually enhances the design thinking process. I don't believe it challenges the design thinking process. It certainly challenges us as human beings to provide value on top of what AI does. But that, I think, is true of every job function. So let's talk about how AI modifies these 4 building blocks. Let's take a look at the first building block, which is that of customer centricity or customer insights, if you will, right? Understanding what is really going on. What is the problem that we are trying to solve? What are the roots of the problem? Can we really understand the problem in all its dimensions, not just what is visible to us? Now, in the old days, when I say the old days, I mean in the pre-AI days, you would do it in the following way. You would essentially figure out, if you're looking to benefit. For example, let's say you were looking at handicapped folks trying to get onto buses, in a city bus system, and the problems that they face. So here, your beneficiary perhaps is the person who's going to be taking the public transportation, who might be physically impaired in some manner. So you would essentially spend a lot of time trying to understand why it is that such people take public transport over other things, because they might have other choices. If they take public transport, how do they basically get to the bus station? Once the bus station comes, what happens? Are they able to get to the front of the queue or not? If they're at the front of the queue, how exactly do they even raise their feet? Or if they're on a wheelchair, how do they basically get into the bus and so forth, right? So you're truly through observation, not through, questionnaires and surveys and so on. Through observation, you're understanding a day in the life, if you will, of that beneficiary. You're also understanding lots of second order things relevant to the beneficiary. Who are they? Where do they come from? What motivates them? What are psyche elements that you should be aware of, and so forth? Because all that is essentially helping you, truly understand the mind of the person that you're trying to benefit, right? Now, that's typically how it would be done in the old days. Now, what AI basically brings to the table is, especially, if you look at Gen AI, it's the ability to use Gen AI almost on the side to simulate these kinds of situations, right? You can essentially work with Gen AI to sort of say, I have a person with a leg impediment that is looking to board a bus. What do you think the various barriers to them boarding a bus might be, right? Now, Gen AI is obviously building on the collective knowledge that it has acquired through multiple sources. So its perspective is going to be a different perspective, hopefully, than what you personally are observing. But it is a valid, generalizable perspective, provided you're skeptical about what it is that it is saying. But therefore, it expands your understanding of that particular customer. Now, there's a bunch of analytical work that you need to get done as well. If you were to solve this problem, how many people are you actually benefiting? What is the value of the benefit that you're actually providing? Are there others trying to provide this benefit? Things that are actually still related to satisfying the customer, but that have elements of competition and alternatives and market size and so forth. They're all still part of that customer discovery process. Gen AI can do a pretty good job of bringing all of that to the table, right? So it brings in essentially a perspective that you, a bunch of analysis that could help you, but you should use it as an augmentation of your own classic design thinking process of getting into the shoes of the observer. So if you try to sit at a desk and try and figure out what it is that this person needs, that doesn't quite feel like design thinking. But if you're out in the field, you're out there learning the way you did, you're standing in the sun and you're standing in the rain, you basically go in the monsoon and figure out what the problems might be for this person boarding the bus. You then perhaps go out in the hot summer and figure out what the problems might be. That kind of an empathetic view of the customer you still need to have. But Gen AI would enhance it in many ways, right? It would give you more insights than you need. So that is basically how AI can be used in that first step. So when we ask our students to go out to a fish market, let's say, and observe the problem of wastage at the end of the day, let's say that's the problem they're trying to figure out. We're going to still insist that they go out into the fish market, spend all day there in the sun, and then observe what happens. How do the fish come in? How do the fish leave? All that they need to see themselves. But how big are the markets? What other markets are there? Has this problem been actually, looked at by other people? All that you can use AI in order to enhance your knowledge of that situation. So that's your first step, right? Your customer insight can be far better if you use AI correctly to augment your own human-driven set of insights. Then when you look at a series of solutions, we brainstorm. AI is a wonderful companion to brainstorm with. So while you might want to definitely brainstorm with your team, there are very few things that are actually, in some ways, more interesting than getting up at 6 a.m. with some idea and saying, I have nobody to talk to. Let me see what, Gemini feels about a particular thing. And that Q&A that you end up with actually expands, your ideas and the possibilities of solutions. Also, Gen AI is pretty good at coming up with solutions. Let's say you're building, I saw an example, you're trying to build a beach chair for older people. All right. So the problem is when old people go to the beach, how do they sit down? How do they enjoy the beach? Because if they sit down on the sand, they may not be able to get up. So maybe what you're trying to figure out is solve that particular problem, right? Increase the enjoyment of old people going to the beach. And therefore, your solution might be some form of a chair, let's say, right? Your solution could also be some sort of a walking stick and so forth. But let's look at chairs. What are all the different chair types that are out there? AI would do a pretty good job of actually throwing up a whole bunch of ideas at you as to ways in which you could actually, construct a chair that might satisfy, old folks. This is a pretty remarkable level of creativity. At one point, this is where we need to be careful as human beings, because we should be cautious in our embrace of Gen AI, and I'm a skeptic in our march towards AGI. I think that is a dangerous thing to do. We don't understand too many things. But with the tools that are available, it certainly helps you ideate and create far more interesting concepts than what you might have done by yourself. Prototypes in the old days, the third step. We used to have our students go into our design thinking lab, sit with 3D printers, work with Arduino board sets to try and create prototypes and so on. Or if you're doing a user interface for a mobile app, they would sit there and they would actually code their app to do what they wanted to do, right? That's the prototyping that they're doing. These things can be knocked out in 10 minutes these days. Gen AI will help you build your physical prototypes, and 10 of them in 1 hour, whereas it might have taken you 10 days to build one prototype. Similarly, user interfaces can get cranked out in a matter of minutes. So prototyping becomes a really, really easy thing to do, right? So that's a key step of design thinking. AI has essentially accelerated that particular step. In terms of iteration, it has made AI makes the cost of iteration cheaper. It is much faster to go into loop 2, loop 3, and so forth, because you fail faster. You don't have to even wait for end customers, by the way, to give a reaction. You can create customer bots using AI, and you actually have AI act as a beneficiary. You tell AI, you are the beneficiary. Tell me if this is working for you or not. So the key here isn't really just to think of AI as this magic technology. It is to still go back to the principles of design thinking, those 4 building blocks that I talked to you about, and then say, how would I incorporate AI into those 4 building blocks in order to be smarter, to be faster, to be more effective, to be more creative, and so on. That's really how the marriage of design thinking and AI works. And honestly, that is how the marriage of AI with anything should work. You need to understand the fundamental process and problem, and then stick in AI where it makes sense.
Definitely, that was a very fascinating perspective, Varun, and thank you for sharing that and helping us understand that how AI can enhance the entire design thinking process, and definitely keeping most of the human-centered phases of design thinking intact. And it's really intriguing to understand and consider how these AI tools can surface patterns we might overlook, or even challenge our assumptions to push us beyond the obvious. So, I hope our listeners, are seeing just how transformative AI can be when it's woven thoughtfully into the entire design process. Not just, not actually replacing human empathy, but, augmenting it and amplifying it.
Can I make a comment on empathy as well?
Sure,
And again, this
sure,
is just be a slightly provocative comment,
sure.
right? We generally we automatically assume empathy is good,
Mm,
right? I'm going to challenge that. See, the nice thing about being an academic is you get to look at all the corner cases, or what we call the boundary conditions, of
right.
where the mainstream narrative, falls, right? So I'll give you 1 or 2 mainstream narratives that fail, because I want to talk to you about the limitations of design thinking as well. There's all kinds of flaws with design thinking that
Mm,
your listeners should be aware of.
right.
One is this reliance on empathy.
Mm,
While it's a good thing, research has shown that there are 2 kinds of empathy that are out there, and they actually have different effects on the level of innovation. So if you look at a whole bunch of interesting research papers, you'll essentially see that the 2 kinds of empathy are what's called a cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy is where you understand what the other person is feeling, right? So mentally, you kind of logically try and understand what that other person is feeling. And affective empathy is more of a knee-jerk thing, right? Somebody's sad, you're sad as well. You don't necessarily get into the root cause of why it is they were sad or why you were sad, right? And we would agree that, empathy, both kinds are good. But if you look at sort of the ability of the designer to be more innovative, in fact, being purely affective empathetic in nature, has a negative correlation on innovation. So those that really have too big a heart and that feel that they really need to solve this problem, but they haven't really understood the root cause of the problem, they haven't understood in a cognitive manner, but they definitely are empathetic, but it's purely at an affective level, which means at an emotional level, they actually tend to not create the right kinds of solutions. Those that empathize at a cognitive level. And you look at it and say, well, that kind of seems backwards, right? That's all about the brain and not the heart. But the fact is, cognitive empathy is what is positively related with innovation, right? So there is one limit, if you will, already. When people talk about empathy, I always want to sort of say, what kind of empathy are we talking about? Because there are two kinds. Only one of them is actually the good kind. Then you basically take a look at another myth of design thinking, right? That it promotes creativity. And I'll tell you about a boundary condition research, and this is actually my own paper on this one. And it establishes that it doesn't always produce creativity. It generally produces creativity, but there is one situation. If a team is trying to assess a problem that they don't personally have any familiarity with, their knowledge of that problem comes almost entirely from watching the beneficiary, right? The customer inciting and so forth. And then they create a set of solutions versus a team that may already have some familiarity with the problem that they're trying to solve. Now, it turns out that when the team that has some familiarity with the problem already uses design thinking, they actually produce good results. A team with no familiarity that is counting on design thinking to produce a creative outcome, turns out that while they produce useful results, they don't produce particularly creative or novel results, right? So there are all these corner conditions that, frankly, if somebody is going to use design thinking, it is important for them to understand, right? So these are what we would call the limitations of design thinking. But the biggest limitation of design thinking that we try to teach here at SPJIMR and also consult with companies on is the fact that design thinking solutions often don't scale. They work beautifully in a pilot. They never actually scale at the way you intended it to. The United Nations and the World Health Organization has spent billions of dollars basically building bathrooms and toilets for clean sanitation around the world. Africa is full of them. They've made grants to India. And we've all seen the TV series Panchayat, right? Where we basically know that the bathrooms being built in villages are oftentimes being used for storage. Well, so here's a failure of design thinking. Why is it that a product that is trying to actually satisfy a deep human need for clean sanitation doesn't get used at all? So the point is, many of these solutions don't scale for various reasons, right? And there's a whole literature of all design thinking solutions that have failed. And many times they fail because they have not considered the overall system within which they're operating, right? And that is the reason when you're trying to understand and focus on the customer or the beneficiary or the consumer, you have to be looking 360 degrees around them at a whole bunch of other factors, because it is most likely these other factors that will cause something to fail, right? It might very well be that what causes remember I was talking about the bus situation, right? Somebody with a handicap trying to get onto a bus. You've done everything, you've studied everything and so forth. But if it turns out that the bus system is such that the schedules are not predictable at all, okay, now that has nothing to do with the bus or the ramp and how somebody gets onto onto the bus. But if the schedules weren't predictable, it might be buses don't actually show up on time. Now, somebody who's handicapped may not necessarily be in a position to suddenly rush if a bus is showing up in a hurry, right? So now a solution you've built, a beautiful ramp, is not going to actually be used by the person who needs it, because the bus just came screaming to a stop because it was running late and then had to take off again. So you see how the delay in a schedule or unpredictable schedules ends up screwing up a great intention you have, which is that of a handicapped person being able to get onto a bus. This idea that a solution works in a larger system is something that I think is missing in many, many places. I see it with our corporate friends. I definitely see it in the way various folks teach design thinking. That linkage between design thinking and systems thinking is, I think, a huge missing component when people teach design thinking. So at SPJIMR, we've actually added a whole set of courses around systems thinking, because in my opinion, design thinking without understanding the larger system that it operates in isn't really going to produce the results that it needs. So, big fan of design thinking, but a realistic fan of design thinking. It has limitations, and for it to work, it really needs to be sitting within a larger system. And a lot of innovators and people who work on sound bites, saying, hey, design thinking, let's go, and so forth, miss that. And then similarly, AI then needs to come onto this design thinking plus systems thinking approach in a thoughtful manner. Once again, apologize for being professorial, but it's near and dear to my heart. And it's something that I teach actually, and along with my faculty members here.
No, definitely. And I think you have given different perspectives regarding how design thinking is, or, what are some of the limitations and challenges in terms of deploying design thinking in today's digital era. So, when we're talking about the limitations, I think we must also emphasize on ethical design principles. I mean, when we are talking about integrating AI with design thinking, I think bias, privacy, and transparency can be afterthoughts in an. So, how do you think, or how do you ensure? I mean, how do you think that organizations can ensure responsible innovation, particularly regarding ethical design and user privacy?
That's actually a great question. So there are two things in there. One is about designing the right thing, and the other phrase you used that I want to emphasize is responsible innovation. Right. So let's talk about each one separately, and then I'll bring them together. Responsible innovation basically means whoever is in charge of the innovation process, is quote unquote responsible about it. But what does responsible mean? So there are four dimensions, to responsibility, and oftentimes there's a framework that is used for responsible innovation called the AREA framework. The first element or the first dimension of responsible innovation is anticipation. So a responsible innovator basically tries to anticipate the consequences of their innovation, right? So even before you build something, you start to think about, if I were to build it, what might happen? What might the second order effects of something that I do be, right? And oftentimes we don't think about the second order effects. We don't anticipate what could happen. And sometimes we can't anticipate it because, the second order effect that shows up was unexpected. So, if, for example, if you were to take a look at Facebook, since we're talking about the digital era, you take a look at Facebook and the like button that they came up with. The innovation team responsible for the like button, which was obviously a very big innovation at the time because it drove user engagement, right? Because people kept going back and back to see if people were liking their posts and so forth, built around some psychology principles. The question is, did the innovation team anticipate what would happen? They anticipated to a point, right? They anticipated from a business point of view that a like button would act like a dopamine, like, one of those things where people want a dopamine hit and they'll go back and back to the page. Therefore, the engagement is higher. You can show them more ads and therefore it would increase revenue. And it did, right? So they anticipated. They did not anticipate, however, that there could be some second or third order consequences. They didn't think about, well, what happens psychologically to somebody who has posted something and turns out that nobody likes it? Or worse, you get a bunch of negative thumbs down. What then, right? So that anticipation wasn't there, but perhaps one could argue, that was so far-fetched at that point. But the first anticipation is the first principle of responsible innovation, right? A responsible innovator always looks around the corner to see what might happen post-innovation. The second one is reflexivity, right? Reflexivity essentially says that once you have collected a bunch of information, you spend time. You don't rush into creating something, which runs so counter to our modern age, right? That you take time to figure out what might possibly happen. So that's the reflexivity part. The E in the area, AREA, is around engagement. It's around who are you actually using as inputs? Are your stakeholders a broad set of stakeholders, or are you just basically looking at a narrow set of stakeholders who you're trying to satisfy? How would society actually get impacted by this? And the last one, A or action, is about responsiveness. So if something goes bad, are you responsible for it or not? Right? And a responsible innovator, therefore, anticipates, tries to get as many inputs as possible and involve as many perspectives as possible, realizes that they can never plan perfectly, but then is, essentially leader enough to stand up and say, I will take consequences for a bad decision. That is something our technology leaders just don't do today. The Facebook leaders should have taken responsibility for the fact that their like button caused teen suicide. They should have taken responsibility for the fact that their like button, while it produced positive economic outcome, produced a massive negative societal outcome. But they didn't take any responsibility for that, right? So responsible innovation should drive these principles in. How do you do it? Remember we talked about an innovation process that exists within any company, and design thinking can be a set of principles that you embed into the process. What you've hit upon is the fact that responsible innovation also can be viewed as a set of principles that get embedded into the process. At different points of the innovation process, the process should allow the senior management, the innovators, etc., to ask these questions. What will happen if this thing were to work well? If it didn't work well, how would we know it's not working well? If there was a societal impact of a bias or something else, how would we know, and what would we do to fix it? Or are we just going to be running on the treadmill fast all the time and bad things happen as they happen? So responsible innovation is as important as design thinking. And responsible innovation, you should look at not as a phrase, but as a set of principles. That's why I gave you 4 principles that you should embed into the innovation process. So that's the way to look at responsible innovation. Now, in terms of ethical user design, um, it's a wonderful area, right? When we teach product management and product design over here, if you take a look at a user interface, you will look at the user interface and say, is it a compassionate user interface? Does it cause anxiety and stress? Does it discriminate against people perhaps with poor eyesight? Does it discriminate? Is it colorblind? People can't use it. So there's a whole bunch of design elements that are around inclusivity, right? That good designers do. But then there are design elements that are around bias, and you're 100% right. I think my product managers that I instruct, we basically talk about where did the data set come from. If you're going to use AI at all in your particular product to do any kind of prediction, to do any kind of recommendation, are we sure that this thing isn't biased? What was the training set that came up? What are some corner conditions under which we will absolutely involve a human in a decision-making process, and so on. So user design, slightly different topic than responsible innovation, because user design is something that individual developers can implement, but responsible innovation is something that the process level, which includes the leadership and the structures that support innovation, need to implement. So that's the distinction between responsible innovation and ethical user design.
Right, definitely. Thank you for giving those deep insights as to how we can implement and ensure ethical design and user privacy. I think as AI technologies continue to evolve, their role in design thinking process will become more integral. The future of design thinking will likely see AI systems playing a more collaborative role with designers, team members offering real-time insights, more ideation support, and of course, rapid prototyping capabilities. Thank you so much, Varun, for taking all the time and effort to be on a podcast today and helping us understand that the intersection of technology with design thinking is shaping the future of, I think, creative problem solving. And by augmenting the design process with AI tools, teams can generate smarter, more user-centric solutions faster and more efficiently than ever before. So thank you so much. It was pleasure having you with us on a podcast today. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you, Priya, and I hope I didn't put you or your audience to sleep. But as you can tell, I think detail and depth is an important thing, and that's kind of what I was trying to provide.
Definitely, definitely. I agree with you. Thank you so much. So, this is for our listeners. Thank you for joining me on today's exploration of wise innovation through design thinking in the AI era. So, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, share it with your colleagues. Until next time, stay more curious, stay empathetic, and keep innovating. You can view all our previous podcasts on Spotify and other leading platforms. Thank you so much.